Hello, and welcome to Food for Thought. It's Mark Lockridge here, the pastor of New Life Fellowship in Letterkenny and Milford Reformed Presbyterian Church. It's great to have you with us. This coming week in the Doyle, our TDs will vote on the subject of assisted suicide. A joint Oireachtas committee on the topic of assisted dying has recommended removing end-of-life protections for those who are deemed terminally ill and deemed to be within the last 6 or 12 months of life. By the term assisted dying, they mean giving people lethal drugs with which they can end their life. My mum had a neurodegenerative disease and spent the last 20 years of her life in a wheelchair. And I watched her pass away a couple of years ago after a long battle with a tumour. I know the awfulness of these circumstances. And I've been a minister for 25 years and have ministered to people in various stages of life, some with terminal illness, some coping with terrible pain. I've seen it up close. Who can't have but the greatest compassion for those in such circumstances? But with all that, I believe that we must oppose these recommendations. They're well-intentioned, but they're fundamentally flawed and have many detrimental consequences for society. Let me give you some of them. A right to die carries with it an obligation for doctors and medical staff to agree with a patient in their desires. This places an unwarranted and unethical pressure on our doctors. It places an obligation on those whose job it is to assist in that process. Also, a right to die slips easily into an obligation to die, to cease to be a burden or a drain on a family's or society's resources. And that's not scaremongering, that's been the experience in numerous other countries like Canada and the Netherlands. And this in turn creates a climate of fear among the elderly and the sick, the very thing that they don't need. And in addition to that, like everything else, it becomes monetized. And insurance packages, instead of offering long-term care, offer better rates for exiting gracefully, in inverted commas. Our own High Court ruled in 2013 that it would be impossible to ensure that the aged, the disabled, the poor, the unwanted, the rejected, the lonely, the impulsive, the financially compromised and emotionally vulnerable would not avail of this option to avoid a sense of being a burden to their family and society. And you see, euthanasia fundamentally damages the complex structure of our society. We exist in community. No man is an island. And we care for one another, and in Ireland we are brilliant at it. The healthy are meant to care for the weak. And rather than communicating the idea that the sick are a burden, we should be communicating the idea that care, no matter how long it is needed, is our privilege to give. Columnist Giles Fraser wrote, "My existence is fundamentally bound up with yours. Of course I will clean you up. Of course I will hold your hand in the long hours of the night. Shut up about being a burden. I love you. This is what it means to love you. Surely there is something extraordinarily beautiful about all of this." And there is. I watched my father care for my mother in exactly this way. And it was beautiful, and it was challenging, and it was a wonderful example. Suffering is terrible, but it can be helped by good palliative care without the need for euthanasia. And we know here in Donegal that there's great hospice care with people who specialise in caring for others as life draws to a close. And dying with dignity can be accomplished without euthanasia. Dignity is not only something we feel in ourselves, it's something that others confer on us by how they treat us. How we care for people as they die confers dignity on them as they're treated with love and gentleness and respect, as thousands of hospice carers do daily. God's command to care for his image bearers extends right through suffering and brings dignity. Those who cared for my mum conferred an enormous dignity and respect on her by how they treated her. She died with dignity because dignity was given to her by those who cared for her. That's what a compassionate society does. That's what we as a society need to be like. It's not the state's place to affirm the monstrous belief that some lives are not worth living, but to encourage the dignity and respect of every life. And we undercut this very cornerstone of a caring society when we allow assisted dying as an option. It's not mankind's responsibility, thankfully, to decide when we will live or die. God has given us this limitation to safeguard us from these consequences. God gives life, and he decides when that life is over. But when a society begins to decide who lives and who dies, it opens up all sorts of unintended consequences, which are drastically damaging. And on top of all of that, the Bible teaches that death is not the end, that God has set eternity in our hearts, and that heaven and hell are the destinies of all mankind. And these recommendations encourage people to think more about the leaving and less about the arriving, which is to skew vital priorities. As a pastor, I spend my time often dealing with those suffering. And I found this: even in the worst of suffering, Jesus Christ grants purpose and hope. When we know Jesus as our Saviour, no suffering is pointless. Knowing him gives purpose to our suffering, strength to our suffering, help in our suffering, and hope for after our suffering. May God grant wisdom to our politicians. And I would encourage you to contact your TD and urge them to vote against these recommendations. But in particular, if you are facing the pain of a terminal illness or prolonged suffering at the minute, may God give you strength and endurance. May he grant you help and ease, and in particular peace with him and hope from him through Jesus Christ, so that you might have everlasting life. Thanks for listening. If you want to get in touch, drop me an email, mark@newlifefellowship.ie. Have a good week.